Good evening, everyone. This is again Don't Give Up Ukraine. This is already our 20th episode, what we are sharing with you. And today we want to start a series of episodes on the Ukrainian diaspora in the context of the current war, of course. And we choose as a topic the Ukrainian diaspora as a third front, and that is something like a wish or a thing or a hypothesis. So the war is now basically fought by the military and politicians and supported, of course, in Ukraine and also outside Ukraine by the Ukrainian diaspora. But maybe we can think about how to strengthen the political force of the diaspora. And I think the Ukrainian diaspora is a very, very important part of Ukraine. So that seems for us a nice way, an interesting way to start thinking about the diaspora or the diasporas. So if you want to say something about it, it's probably more than one, that's for sure, and also more types than one type. So I'm very happy to have with us Mychailo Wynnyckyi. And I hope I pronounce your name in the right way, Mychailo. Otherwise, I apologize for that. And Christina Santore, and they will introduce themselves in a minute. And then, as usual, we start with asking the two of you for how was your week. That is our weekly question, and it leads to the kind of chronicle of the war nowadays. And then we start discussing our topic. So. Mychailo, may I ask you to introduce yourself?
Okay. Well, my name is Mychailo Wynnyckyi. I'm an associate professor at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, which is the premier university. We consider it the premier university in Ukraine. A little bit of an elitist small school. I've been living in Ukraine for the last 20 years. Prior to arriving, I lived in the UK for 4 years, where I did my PhD and my master's. But in fact, as the accent gives away, I was actually born in Canada, and 27 years of my life I spent there. Grew up in a place called Kitchener, and was very active, same as Christina, in Plast. Come from a sort of a Plast family, which is the Ukrainian scouting organization. I've been quite active in terms of blogging and keeping up. I would say that the one of the fronts of the war is certainly the information front, trying to keep up as much as possible in terms of on-the-ground analysis, as I used to do during both revolutions, in other words, the 2004 Orange Revolution and then the 2013-14 protests that led to what was called the Revolution of Dignity. And of course, now I'm keeping up something called Thoughts from Kyiv, which is my blog, and try to do as much as I can in terms of an English language analysis on the ground of what's going on. So I guess that's probably as good an introduction as I'll get at the moment.
Thank you very much, Mychailo. So also welcome to Orissa. So we are the partners in crime in this Don't Give Up Ukraine. So short note of yourself, Orissa.
Hello, everybody. My name is Orissa Bila. I'm a colleague of Ruud, a philosopher, and also professor for Ukrainian Catholic University. Right now, I'm staying in Lviv. We are doing now this series for a while, right? And we know each other for a very long time. We work together. We work together in Ukraine on integrity programs for our local governments in Lviv and Chernivtsi. And right now we continue working on intellectual front of fighting against Russia and the Russian invasion.
We do what we can as philosophers. So.
Yes.
Thank you. Christina, can you share a couple of things about yourself?
Sure, thank you, Ruud. I'm Christina, or Christina in Ukrainian, Santore. I am by profession a writer and communications, media, publishing, and cultural consultant and entrepreneur, working internationally for various sectors from Amsterdam, where I've been based for the last 25 years. But I think what's more pertinent to the conversation this evening is indeed, as Mychailo mentioned, I grew up in the Ukrainian diaspora of the United States, and to be specific, the post-World War II diaspora. As Rud mentioned, there are various phases to the diaspora and various diasporas, which I'm sure we'll get to when we discuss the history. So my background is very similar to Mychailo's in terms of the context of our upbringing, how our families got to the United States and to Canada. But of course, the United States and Canada have similar but very different diasporas as a result of the cultural situation in both of those countries, which will be also something interesting to discuss tonight and later when you explore it in your series. The US diaspora was very active, as was the Canadian. And, in a way, we grew up activists from the moment we could hold the flag and talk. We were protesting and going to Ukrainian school and learning all the Ukrainian things and, keeping Ukraine alive. More on that later. I moved to the Netherlands 25 years ago, and it was like, from the diaspora point of view, a big culture shock in terms of like from in full-on intense diaspora to no diaspora, although I was working for organizations that were dealing with Ukraine. It really took me nearly 20 years to meet Ukrainians in the Netherlands, and that was after Maidan and the annexation of Crimea. That's when the Ukrainian diaspora really came together and solidified and began becoming active, partially as a result of the evolution of social media, for sure, that helped us find each other. And I've been active ever since, but I think more of that will come out in the context of our conversation.
Thank you very much for sharing this. So, if I ask the two of you, Mychailo and Christina, how is Ukraine this week, when it comes to the war? Of course, what would you say?
Well, Rud, I'm at the moment at what we would in Ukraine call a dacha. It's, I guess, a country home that we have usually for the summer. But thankfully, when we built it, we actually winterized it because this is our safe haven. It's to the south of Kyiv. The reason we're here is because we are actually in Kyiv at our apartment. We have an apartment in Podil. And when the rocket fell on Sunday morning, that was a little bit too close for comfort. And so we decided that on Monday, we would be leaving and going back to our dacha. My week started with a rocket attack, approximately 2.5, 3 kilometers from where I live. And it was a very loud morning. There are multiple reports of how many rockets were fired on Kyiv that day. Up to 14, obviously two major explosions and a third one, and then several missiles were downed due to anti-aircraft fire. So the week has started with sort of a reminder that the war is not just in the east in the Donbass, but is actually quite close. And clearly that was a bit of an eye-opener, let's put it that way.
And how was it for you, Christina?
Well, I'm watching it from. Oops, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Yeah. No, I thought I muted myself. I always say we can't complain. Here in the diaspora, we can't complain. I mean, we watch from a distance. We do have impact because we are helping thousands, if not tens of thousands of refugees and doing what we can to support the war effort. And it is like a daily tsunami of needs and requests and information. But we can't complain. So we watch from a distance, and it's like an emotional roller coaster. And very challenging to parse through all of the information flow to know exactly what is what. So it's been a busy week because there are just constant initiatives and constant needs. In particular, as Mychailo mentioned, we are both very active in PLAST, and that's actually how we know each other. We met as teenagers in Canada in PLAST when I was visiting a camp there. That is an important initiative that is taking place in the diaspora. PLAST exists in Ukraine, but it existed in the diaspora up to Ukrainian independence, and now continues to exist in the diaspora, and especially in Europe, it is developing very quickly, not least because we have a very large influx of displaced Ukrainians, and among them displaced members of PLAST who are now in Europe.
Makes both of your answers make clear that. And it's very much something I very much recognize, that it's in one sense, the war is rather, how would you say that, abstract as a thing. It's a happening on world scale. And then on the other hand, it's affecting your daily life. Even like Mychailo said, well, this became just a bit too close, So it sounds a bit like an understatement, but we have all seen this week, this rocket on this missile on the supermarket, and it's like, well, as I said, one of these our conversations earlier, that a friend of mine who was Michiel Driebergen, who is journalist in Ukraine, is actually now in Ukraine. He said, well, I talked to a lot of war correspondents in Ukraine, and they were at Chechnya and they were at Syria, and they said, well, this is worse. This is worse. We haven't seen this before, what's now happening in Ukraine. And that makes you also a bit of, not only of angry, but also gives you a feeling of helplessness, so to say, what you have to overcome every day. So to say, and that's my experience.
I think one thing that is happening to people in the diaspora too is with each week, it literally comes closer to home, because with each week, the degrees of separation between people who you actually know who are dying on the front line, or displaced internally or displaced externally, becomes smaller the longer that this goes on.
Yeah. Would you say something about this, Orisa?
You mean about the last week?
Yes.
I quite share what Mychailo said, because I'm in the same situation. We have, this is, I think, one of the most important features of our life in Ukraine now is totally unpredictable. We look in an open mouth of our analytics, trying to guess what the next week can turn into. And it's absolutely hard to, it's impossible to understand how this war will develop, like 2 days from now. And people are preparing for different type of scenarios, but it's important not to underestimate, because the underestimation costs lives. And
Ruud, if I
yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
On the other hand, if you overestimate, you actually get neurosis. So how to find a middle ground?
I think that I have a very good friend. His name is Valery Pekar here in Ukraine. One of my closest friends, and he has this concept of the fact that time is very relative. And I think that you, as a philosopher, Ruud, would probably understand this feeling that. Orisa just mentioned the fact that you can't plan and that everything is unpredictable, and that's very true. Look, this week I woke up on Sunday with an explosion and watching smoke through my window. On Monday, I was at the train station picking up my wife, who was arriving from Poland. We then left to our dacha. This week we've had the G7. This week we've had the NATO meeting. This morning we had news of the fact that Zmyiny Island, or Snake Island, is now no longer under Russian control. We've had the loss of Severodonetsk over the weekend. Loss, meaning the pullout of the Ukrainian troops. At the same time, Lysychansk is still being held. We've had Kherson being approached by Ukrainian troops in a counterattack. In other words, I agree with the fact that you can't plan anything. I just finished a meeting with some colleagues, academic colleagues at the University of Toronto, and they're talking about, what should we plan for September? And my attitude is, I hope to get through July. The planning horizon is approximately 3 to 4 weeks. Beyond that, we really don't know what's going on next. And the reason for that is because time is going very quickly. There's so many events happening on a daily basis. And although technically, I mean, why should Zmyiny Island or Lysychansk, which are both, 800 kilometers away from where I am, or perhaps 700, why should they affect me? Well, they do affect me because at the end of the day, that's the front line, and rockets fly into the capital and they fly into Kremenchuk, as you mentioned with the shopping center, and they certainly fly into Lviv, and Yavori was destroyed yet again, was bombed, which is just outside of Lviv. Was bombed on Sunday again. So, the fact is that the entire country is under attack, even though the front line may be a little bit distant. So if you don't necessarily turn on the internet, if you don't necessarily turn on Telegram, and you don't watch TV, then theoretically, being in a place like I am, in a village, you could forget about the fact that there's a war on, well, except for the fact that there are, today I saw 2 MiG-29s and a Su-25 flying overhead. The guys, thankfully ours, they're training. So, one of them was on a sortie because it looked like it had rockets on board. But the point is that if you ignore the airplanes overhead and the helicopters periodically and the missiles falling nearby, then you could theoretically forget about the fact that there's a war on. But realistically, you can't. And therefore, because of the fact that there's so much going on, there's really very little planning that can be happening, which I think is perhaps a little strange for the people that are listening to us from outside of Ukraine, because clearly I think that most of us plan, a minimum of 2 months, 3 months in advance, if not more than that. I mean, some of us have career plans. Those were put on hold as of February 24th for all of us in Ukraine.
But if I can just say from the diaspora point of view, I think that sort of inability to plan and that state of constant flux also applies to us to a large extent because we react to events there. So it is really difficult for us here to, yes, we try to plan, but we get thrown, as things develop there, we get new tasks here that we have to respond to sometimes very quickly, depending on which area of the war effort one is involved in. So as the needs change, as the developments change, our activities change, and so it does make it hard to plan for people who are active in the diaspora right now. It's difficult to even to plan your social life, which at the moment seems very irrelevant anyway, these days, or personal life. It's obviously not the same thing, but it definitely does affect us personally too.
Yep. It also immensely intensifies your social life. That's my experience also, and it does appeal to you to a talent that I have learned to appreciate in Ukraine. That is your amazing talent to improvise. And so I'm not kidding. So this is really something what's very special maybe for you. And that's something that, okay, that's what we are, but I have to learn to appreciate that and sometimes to hate that, so to say that, but that's, if you look a bit also at the war, and it's going on in a military way, then you were doing it in a much more intelligent way than the Russians are doing, so to say. But okay, let's leave it for our how was the week. I think this is very important to keep on thinking about this, so to say. And let's with our topic, Ukrainian diaspora as a political force, a third front in the war. So, first of all, maybe a personal question, because both of you, Christina and Mychailo, are from the diaspora. You already said something about this, or maybe you don't. So it's just an estimation. Maybe you said, "Well, I lived in Canada, but I was not part of the diaspora," which totally possible, I think. So, but maybe you can say something of your personal experience as being part or not part of this diaspora to make it a kind of a personal experience.
Well, if that question is to me first, I'll try to answer. I think that Christina was very good about talking about the fact that we both come from very active diaspora families. So the reality was that in our family, at least, I went to a French school. The language on the street was English, but as soon as you entered the house, the language was Ukrainian. Saturday, my friends, schoolmates, would play hockey, would play soccer, would do a variety of different things. Saturday morning, I went to Ukrainian school. I used to be a little anecdotal story about the diaspora and how what it's like to live in the diaspora. I was at the age of 15, I was selected for the Canadian national junior national team in freestyle. I was pretty good at skiing moguls, and unfortunately, all of the competitions were on Saturday morning. So my father told me, "Well, I'm sorry, but you may have been selected, but you're not going skiing on Saturday mornings. You won't be competing because there's Ukrainian school." So what was Ukrainian school? It was language. It was a little bit of literature, lots of history, geography, basically things that had to do with a connection to Ukraine. And obviously, plus the scouting organization that both of us belonged to was also about connections to Ukraine. It was about preserving the language in an environment when we knew full well that there was in Ukraine a massive policy of Russification. So we were preserving a language which later, when Ukraine became independent, it turns out that we were very often preserving the language of our ancestors and in the way that the language was spoken in 1944 when they left. Obviously, languages develop. And so under Russian influence, under, I think, modernization, etc., the language changed. And so when we arrived in Ukraine in 89, 90, 91 the first time, our language turned out to be different. Even though we spoke Ukrainian, we spoke a different kind of Ukrainian. And as a matter of fact, in Ukraine today, it's known as a sort of a diaspora Ukrainian, which is different from the Ukrainian that is spoken, for example, in Lviv, in Kyiv. The diaspora experience was pretty intense, and it was very much something that that generated my identity. And one of the things that I think is important that I want to mention is that when I came to live in Ukraine, I was not necessarily accepted by Ukrainians as being one of them or one of us, if you like. In other words, there is I think one of the things that has changed now during the war is this realization, and it's a result of the fact that so many Ukrainians have had to flee and become displaced into Poland, into other countries in Europe, and also into North America. I think there's a realization that Ukrainian is a global community. Where it was not, that realization was not there, I would even say 10 years ago. One of the reasons in which I took up Ukrainian citizenship it was a very emotional thing for me. I was granted Ukrainian citizenship in 2019 after 17 years of living in Ukraine. And the reason I took Ukrainian citizenship is because of a feeling of being, in Ukrainian we say, чужий серед своїх. In other words, being a foreigner amongst our own. The Ukrainian identity in Ukraine was very much a citizenship-oriented identity, whereas the identity of the diaspora was an ethnic identity. And those things are quite different. And that actually in the future is probably going to, after the war ends, is probably still going to be an issue that we're going to have to resolve. But for the moment, the war has led to a consolidation of identity and to a sort of a global Ukrainian community, which I think is very important. it's not monolithic. It's not. It's very diverse. It's not necessarily, sort of you are Ukrainian or you're not. There are many shades of Ukrainian, as there always have been in the diaspora, and there always have been in Ukraine. But there is a consolidation of patriotism at the moment, which I think is very important because, as you say, the third front requires a global response. And I think that one of the reasons that we have such a massive global response from world leaders is because of the fact that we have such a huge diaspora, which for literally over 100 years has become so politically influential in their countries. This goes obviously for Canada and the US, for the UK, for Poland, for many, many other countries. But I think that Ukrainians in the world are a force that we as Ukrainians very often don't even realize the extent to which that force is something to be mobilized, to be used, and to be cherished, I think, on all sides.
Thank you. You just said also something that you came back from Canada to Ukraine. So and
I don't like the concept of came back because I am an immigrant from Canada to Ukraine. In other words, I've gone the opposite direction of most people. Obviously, there are many more people that have immigrated from Ukraine to Canada. But I don't like the statement of come back because I didn't leave Ukraine. My parents left as children during the Second World War. They arrived in Canada. My mother was 16, my father was 17, and they had left Ukraine at the age of 12 and 13. So not of their own choice. And they grew up in Canada and raised me in Canada. And so I have no reason to say come back.
You could easily be from the Canadian diaspora in Ukraine.
Yes, if you like. That's one of the things that I had a discussion on my Facebook page when we were announcing today's event, today's talk, with a lady that at the moment is living in Germany, and she's calling me a Canadian expat in Ukraine, which I guess is okay as well. But the reality is that this is home. And when I was asked when the war began, well, why don't you leave? Obviously, there would not be a problem for me to leave. The answer is very simple. This is home, and I have nothing against Canada. Canada is a second home, and I think that one of the things that we can have as global citizens today is two homes. But this one is under attack at the moment, and I'm very pleased that Canada is very much at the forefront of helping Ukraine in its defense today.
Are you aware that in the Netherlands you could have two passports, an Ukrainian and a Dutch, for instance? So I think it's not possible in Ukraine.
There are problems with that, yes.
Not yet, shall we say.
How would you describe your experience as a diasporian, Christina?
Well, my experience, the experience of the first half of my life is very similar to Mychailo's. And so I won't go into detail repeating it. Maybe I'll just say that really what colored our experience is the fact that our parents were war refugees. They were escaping the burgeoning Soviet advance on Western Ukraine and had to flee. And so this immersive experience we had was shaped by, a flight that was not chosen, it was imposed. There was, initially there was the idea of maybe we will go back, and then the realization that no, probably we won't go back. So we have to keep Ukraine alive in the diaspora outside of Ukraine. And of course that evolved as the decades passed and as political developments occurred. What's interesting for me is coming to the Netherlands, and then very late in my Netherlands-based part of my life, coming into contact with or being part of the formation of a bona fide Ukrainian community, because there was always a diaspora in an abstract sense, right? If there are people here, then they are technically the diaspora, but they were not grouping together as Ukrainians, partially because up until the events of Euromaidan and Maidan, there was a lot of interaction between Russians and Ukrainians in the Netherlands. So there was not a need to really assert a separate identity because it was convenient to be fraternal in a place where you're both groups are outsiders and they share some common references that, of course, now Russia tends to overplay. But it was an Achilles heel for the formation of a diaspora until there was a point of conflict that, Ukrainians had to realize that there was a purpose to forming a community that was dedicated to themselves, forming their own Ukrainian schools, forming their own churches, not going to the Russian churches, not sending their children to Russian school. So it's been interesting for me to see that coming from the experience that I had. And I think what is happening is the current situation, which is in some ways a deja vu of what happened after the Second World War, some differences, but a lot of similarities, is making people realize that, you can't take anything for granted. We can't be complacent as Ukrainians living abroad who are comfortable, who have good jobs, or don't have good jobs or whatever, that we can't just sit back and assume that everything is going to be okay with Ukraine like it has been for the past 30 years, because we know, really behind the scenes, it hasn't always been okay. And it's definitely not really okay now. And we are confident that it will be, but in the meantime, we need to actually play the same role that the diaspora played after the Second World War, and act more actively, because we can now directly help Ukraine, which we could not do in the same way in Soviet times until later, where it was possible to exert some political pressure. But the Iron Curtain was, a quite big obstacle to surmount. And here we have more access, and there's just more dialogue thanks to political developments, thanks to the development of social media, a lot of factors that allow us to be more directly in support of what is going on there. So that's sorry to be a bit long-winded about that, but yeah, that's my sort of focusing on my experience of the diaspora here. So I feel like, yes, this is familiar to me. What we're doing here now with all of us, it's familiar to me. This is what we should be doing, but we can do more. And I think that's one of the things we're going to talk about still in this discussion.
Of course. So, thank you. So, Orissa, I just remembered you lived 7 years in the United States. So, no. If I remember well.
Right. And what really impressed me always in diaspora there is that there are really evident differences in generations. People that come the after-war diaspora, and then, for example, the recent diaspora, they had really different motivations, and as a result, these are people that share the same ethnic background, but they have this is like really different groups of people. They even had probably you know it better than me, they had even the internal conflicts among themselves, like they had names for the groups, separating each other. But what really interests me now when we talk about this, what is really impressive about Canadian and American diaspora, especially this after-war diaspora, it's very politically loaded. It's people like Mychailo said that his father insisted that he drops the sports for the sake of the Ukrainian identity, for the Ukrainian school.
Yeah.
And I think I couldn't imagine that happening to the parents that would come, for example, to United States or Canada in 90s. I don't think this works the same.
No, because it was in that, and I forgot to mention that. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, commenting also on the initial diaspora here, it's the difference between a political and an economic diaspora, right? So in an economic diaspora, your tendency is to assimilate, right? To to integrate and assimilate, so that, because your motivations, like you said, are different, whereas the immigration of our parents, it was political, and so the objectives are different, right? And but I think it's changing now, right? Because now the people who came for an economic immigration in Europe are seeing that, we have
So
to.
let me take you a bit back and then come back to this discussion, and maybe I will ask Mychailo. So just suppose that also people are watching our live stream and are not Ukrainians and are just curious about what's actually the Ukrainian diaspora. And if you would give them a 2-minute introduction, Michael, what would you say? Mychailo, I have to say, what would you say about that?
Okay. Well, I think that, look, we just mentioned Christina just mentioned the concept of economic versus political diaspora. Let's start with this. North America is different from Europe, because Ukrainians tended to sort of use European countries as, I guess, transit points, and generally throughout the last 150 years, their final destination would have been either North America or perhaps to some extent Australia. Some went to Argentina, Brazil, but the point is that it would be in what would be called the New World. First wave of immigration happens at the end of the 19th century, generally from Western Ukraine, generally farmers who are actually going to Western Canada, to some extent to the United States as well, but primarily to Western Canada, because the Canadian government was handing out free land and needed to populate the country. That is obviously an economic immigration. Interestingly enough, that those people, even though many of them were illiterate, many of them these were very poor folk looking to start a better life, but for economic reasons. Many of them, in fact, did retain their identities 5, 6, 7 generations forward. They didn't necessarily retain the language, so very often in Ukraine they're considered to be assimilated, etc. But they certainly do have an identity. And in the 2016 census in Canada, we had over 1.3 million Ukrainians. In other words, people would actually identify themselves as Ukrainian in 1.3 million cases. Clearly, these are not people that just came from Ukraine, and these are not people that came for political reasons after the Second World War. These would have been the generations of Ukrainians that would have kept their identity over time. In the interwar period, between the First and the Second World War, we would generally have a more, if you like, working class, again, economic migration. Many people would be going primarily to the United States in this case, looking for work. Many would be staying for a couple of years and going back to Ukraine. In other words, there would have been a movement back and forth. Interestingly enough, in Canada at least, I mean, this is one of the things that I researched, and my mother did a lot of research on this. We had a very large leftist Ukrainian movement. And as a matter of fact, this sort of the Socialist Party of Canada, and very often the Communist Party of Canada, was very often supported, in fact, by these people from Ukraine. And this is very interesting, given the fact that this would have been a massive area of conflict after the Second World War, because here you would have Second World War refugees that would be coming for political reasons, trying to escape the Soviet Union, and here you and arriving with a Ukrainian diaspora that would have been in Canada, and that would have been quite strong in terms of its socialist and very often communist leanings. Now, obviously, that changed in the 1930s with the Holodomor and the repressions in Ukraine. And as soon as news of that came, many of these people did no longer, and as a matter of fact, that was one of the reasons for their assimilation, was because they lost part of their identity. Nevertheless, the thing that I wanted to say is that what we're seeing today is, as Christina actually said, very similar to what our parents experienced as political migrants after the Second World War. They would have arrived in a country where the Ukrainian diaspora would have been economic migrants, or if you like, the descendants of economic migrants. And suddenly here you have political refugees arriving. And the reason, and even though this caused conflict, very often what it also resulted is in a massive support structure, support network. And I think this is really the secret of the diaspora, is the fact that one generation supports the next, regardless of the reasons that the originals came. The support structure it's not just a question of supporting people because you are Ukrainian, but that is part of it. It's a massive network. Some would call it a mafia. I like calling it a mafia. Of Ukrainians throughout the world that support each other. I mean, I was little anecdotal story. This would have been 35 years ago, actually a little more than that. My father was a professor, and he was invited to do some research, and we spent 6 months in Australia. So I did my 8th grade in Australia, and we arrived. We knew absolutely no one. Obviously, this is way before internet, way before actually. Calling to Canada was extremely expensive, and we would have actually a satellite skip. So I mean, obviously different communications network at the time. But my father brought with him a little booklet of an address book with plast, in other words, Ukrainian scouting contacts. Within a day, we had a car. Within 2 days, we had an apartment. Within 3 days, we were at church, and I was in Ukrainian school. The point is that support network was just absolutely immediate. And I think that this is something that we see today, that, the fact that we used to joke about this when I was a student at the Ukrainian Students Club in Toronto. There are only 2 types of people in this world. There are those that are Ukrainian and those that want to be. Today, we are seeing that in action. If you are Ukrainian, it's a ticket to all kinds of access to support structures, etc. And obviously, it's tragic that this has to be activated now in such a way because of the war. But again, we as a sociologist, I'm very well versed in this concept of social capital. We have an amazing amount of social capital in the Ukrainian diaspora, and the Ukrainians arriving today into Europe and into North America, fleeing the war, and Ukrainians in Ukraine are definitely feeling the value of that social capital. The fact that we have, I use this example a lot, Christia Freeland. The surname is obviously not Ukrainian. But and her husband's name is Bowley, so it's obviously not Ukrainian either. But their children are Halinka, Ivan, and I don't remember the third one. I apologize. Christia Freeland, for those that don't know, is the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada and Finance Minister. She's the second person in the Canadian government. The fact that we have a Ukrainian speaker, someone who is and former foreign minister, Canadian foreign minister, a Ukrainian speaker, someone who has lived in Ukraine, someone who has massive connections, and she is not unique. There are huge number of politicians, business people, etc., that grew up in the diaspora, that today are a resource for Ukrainians, for the Ukrainian government, for Ukraine in its fight for existence. And to finish off with this long monologue, I apologize. This war is genocidal. Putin and the Russians and the Kremlin want to destroy Ukraine and everything that is Ukrainian, including the diaspora. It's not a question of, it's just about Ukraine. Lavrov, when he was asked once about why does, for example, Canada support Ukraine so much, he actually said it's because of the rabid Ukrainian diaspora, and he didn't mean bunny rabbits. Yeah, it means it's a disease that supposedly these Ukrainians, they're so patriotic, they're so supportive of each other, and at the same time they lobby their governments to be able to provide support to Ukraine. Unfortunately, and I will end on a very on a down note, I think that the Ukrainians in Ukraine and the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian state still needs to learn to recognize the value of that diaspora. We need to work on that on both sides, but diaspora is not just a resource. It's also something that needs to support from the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian community in Ukraine as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this. So this network of solidarity, and intergenerational, what you're saying, so is that maybe, Christina, something what is the difference with, for instance, the diaspora in the Netherlands? So I know it a bit, and you know it very well. So I don't think we have this intergenerational buildup of the diaspora in the Netherlands.
Well, not yet. I mean, I think it's a younger diaspora. It will take time because really, of course, there were some instances of migration after the Second World War, but the Netherlands were not one of the key places that people went. And as Mychailo said, it was often just a transit point. Ukrainians went to Belgium because there were coal mines. So there is the diaspora there, for example, is much more established and is older. So sort of larger Ukrainian migration has happened here in the Netherlands, let's say in the past 20 years. So I think, we're growing towards what we see in other countries, we will grow towards here. One thing that I just wanted to touch on, just from the historic point of view, is, and Mychailo covered a lot of what also applied to the US, but later, after, let's say in the 70s and 80s, there was another kind of, let's say more 80s, there was another kind of migration, and that was the Soviet Jewish migration from Soviet territories. And why is that important? It's important because a lot of Ukrainian Jews immigrated during that time, but because of the influence and the structure of the Soviet Union, they did not consider themselves Ukrainians at the time. And in that sense, this Russian project to destroy the diaspora is very old and very insidious, because it really begins with the project to destroy the Ukrainian identity in Ukraine. And then, as these people moved out of Ukraine to ensure that they didn't identify themselves in Ukraine. Thankfully, that's changing. And I think it's really important because the Ukrainian Jewish voices are definitely ones that are needed in the contemporary diaspora. And I'm really pleased to see people now identify themselves, people who before said, oh, my family is from Russia. I'm a Russian Jew, but my family is from, when you ask where the family is from, they're clearly from Ukrainian places. But now there's much more awareness of people's own backgrounds and of history, how things went. And this is enriching the Ukrainian diaspora because they are participating in it, and not just, obviously there is a Jewish diaspora, but the Ukrainian Jewish diaspora has a particular character. And we see it also with Ukrainians who immigrate to Israel, where they form, they have a separate Ukrainian diaspora there as well.
May I ask, from your perspective, from your life experience, how many years it takes for diaspora that comes to to become so to say an agent, right? Because what I see now from my own experience, I stayed for 3 months in Netherlands, and I see that mostly these are women with the little kids. And they are, because there are no men, or there are really few men, and they are like trying they're caregivers to their own kids, and so they don't take much effort, or it's really even hard for them to unite around certain agenda. And for them, for this generation to become a diaspora, to become an agent of its own, how long will it take?
Okay, so that's a really wonderful question. I want to say two things about this. I think that there's no universal statement of how long will it take. The key is that there's a difference between the concept of diaspora and emigres. So people that are refugees or emigres are, my father used to say this, they're sitting on their suitcases. In other words, they're sitting on their suitcases and they're expecting to be, in other words, the place where they are is temporary. And as you described, women with children, they're in the Netherlands, or they're in Poland, or they're in the European countries at the moment temporarily. And their thinking is a temporary kind of thinking. Whereas at some point in time, in order for emigres to become a diaspora, the suitcases have to be opened and roots have to be put down. I think one of the important things that is not necessarily understood in Ukraine is that people that are in the diaspora are fully Canadian, they are fully American, they are fully Dutch, they are fully German. In other words, it's not just a question of citizenship. They are people that put down roots and build their own lives within those countries, retaining a connection at the same time to Ukraine. That is not treason. That is not giving up Ukraine. That is not a question of, because in Ukraine, very often the statement is, well, they've left and so, they're no longer us until such time as we need them, in which case then it's, oh, where's our diaspora? Again, I think this is, so there's no universal model. People that are emigrating from Ukraine in their ages less than 30, they will put down roots much faster than people that are 30 plus. That's my experience. I think 30 is maybe 25, maybe 30. This is one of the reasons that I'm very concerned about, for example, the fact that we have a very large number of students at the moment, bachelor students, that are going to be in Europe for an extended period of time. I think that might lead to brain drain. These people may not come back because they will put down roots in Europe. So they will strengthen the diaspora, but they will not necessarily come back to Ukraine. How long does that process take? Well, if people are arriving 40 plus, then probably it's going to take a very long time because their children will be the ones that will be putting down the roots. If they're arriving 20, 25, maybe up to 30, they will be putting down the roots, and then the diaspora will. The key is how long does it take for someone who has displaced themselves, be it through immigration or through refugees, whatever, how long does it take for that person to begin to understand that the new home is home, and yet at the same time we keep our old roots. In my family, it was a process that took approximately 5 to 6 years. Within 5 to 6 years of arriving in Canada, our family understood full well that Canada was home. But I think that was a different time. That was after the Second World War, 6 years of war, etc. Hopefully, we will not have 6 years of war this time, and so the case will be different.
Well, I think it's very important you say there is not a diasporatic blueprint or something. So that's what you're saying, and the circumstances in the end of the 19th century and the country we are going to was very much different than when you are now, where we are basically in a global world, so to say, that distances are much more easier to cover, so to say. So that's also, but I think this is a very important question, because there's some things I read about diaspora, if the concept of diaspora is still appropriate to ask this question. I think so, but you can think about it. We have actually also here our weekly meeting of Ukrainian refugees in a church here in my city, and we are always with 4 or something. So, and then my friends there are speaking Ukrainian. I'm not speaking Ukrainian, so we have this playing with Google Translate and so on. And what I understand by Dimo, how he's called, talking to us and talking to his friends, then I hear the word diaspora. So he sees it as a kind of an ideal to work on, to get the people together and to change it in a kind of a political agent, so to say, because that's, of course, what's at stake now, defeat the Russian Federation and to save not only Ukraine but also us from this totalitarian menace, I would say. So maybe that's a good point to go to this question of the diaspora as a political force, and opening up the third front. I will share a bit of the things why we came up with this idea. So this is the third front is not by definition for me a diaspora front, but a civic front. What unites not only Ukrainians but also for instance my fellow countrymen in the Netherlands, so to say. And this is one of the questions. What keep occupying me is how the diaspora in the Netherlands, of all over the world, of course, but the Netherlands, my experience, could be a kind of a core of uniting not only Ukrainians in the Netherlands, but also, let's say, the NGOs, our labor unions, our Greenpeace, Amnesty International, whatever. And to create a kind of a third front, a civic front, what I think is very much important to keep our governments under pressure, to keep the public opinion well informed about what's going on, and so on. So I'm wondering how you see that. Maybe these are two questions. How did the war actually affect the diaspora? But do you see the diaspora as a core of such a civic front? Whoever will ask this question, so I will answer this question.
I think there are two dimensions to that, right? To political power. There's soft power and there's hard power. And the diaspora is tasked with both, but I want to refer in this thought to something that Mychailo has been writing a lot about lately, and that is this hive behavior where everybody in the community, and in this case, he's talking specifically about Ukrainians, and he's talking about Ukrainians in Ukraine in his recent writings, but you can recognize it immediately in the diaspora. Everybody knows their place in the hive. Okay, we're in an extreme situation right now, and thankfully in an extreme situation, everybody knows what they have to do and which bees are tasked with the soft power and which bees are tasked with the hard power or influence. What we have to learn how to do better as the diaspora and as let's say world Ukrainianism is to work that way even in peace, not only in times of conflict, but in times of peace, because actually it's in the times of peace that a lot of things that lay the foundation for conflict actually occur, right? So we need to be better about understanding who's good with the soft power, who's good with the hard power. And I think that the diaspora in general is very good with soft power. What the diaspora needs to do more of in Europe in particular, I think the US and Canada and older diasporas are better at cultivating political participants. So people from the diaspora who become really credibly politically engaged, like Chrystia Friedland. So we need to see more Ukrainians, people of Ukrainian descent, being directly involved in the political process. And the rest, with the soft power, semi-hard power, pushing on that process and also winning over hearts and minds of the communities that they are operating in.
Mm.
If I'm going to add to that, I think that, thank you, Christina, for bringing up the beehive concept. That turned out to be extremely popular. I wasn't expecting it to be such. It's a metaphor that I brought up in terms of what I was trying to get across is this idea of leaderless agency. Yeah. So we're so used to the fact that in order for things to happen, you have to have a hierarchy. You have to have someone that is leading. Someone says, I know what to do, follow me. Or here, do this, do this, do this. Here are the instructions, etc. In a beehive, there are no instructions. And as a matter of fact, the queen bee is kind of busy doing her own thing. And then and the bees are somehow or other know exactly what to do. I think this is exactly what surprised everybody about Ukraine's resistance, and it turned out to be a global phenomenon. Now, I think that what the hard power, soft power stuff that Christina was just mentioning, where we have problems with that in Ukraine and with Ukrainians in general is that we really dislike hierarchy. We really don't like leadership. We don't like formalizing leadership, and that causes some problems because it when you're in a scenario of crisis, I mean, and everybody sort of comes together to do what needs to be done, then this heterarchy, as we call it, in other words, this idea of the beehive, works really nicely. But if you need to sustain something over the long term, you need to have perhaps, we certainly, as sociologists, we don't necessarily know yet how to create a beehive that's going to be effective in the long term. And the way humans have come together normally is in bureaucracies or in hierarchies that have instructions where people sort of follow instructions and know what to do as a result of that. And we have process management and those sorts of things. Ukrainians aren't very good at that. We're good at coming together flat, helping each other, using the network structure, those types of things. I think that's a strength. We need to learn the other side as well. I think that Ukrainians in Ukraine need to recognize the strength of the network. Ukrainians in the diaspora need to understand that it can't just be about network, because if it is just about network and we all hate our leaders as soon as they become leaders, that really is not very effective at keeping institutions going for a very long term. So there are problems. I mean, we're not an ideal community, but the fact that we are a community, I think, makes us pretty unique, and we need to recognize that huge strength is there. Because, as I say, I think that Russia is threatened not just by Ukraine, but by Ukrainians as a global community, as a concept. That's what they're trying to destroy.
But to make it a bit like insultive, wouldn't you say that you're now underachieving as a Ukrainian diaspora worldwide?
Well, if I can just maybe add something to what Mychailo said that I think will lead to what you're saying, is one thing that we forgot to mention in our historic conversations is that in the run-up to and in the wake of Ukrainian independence, the Ukrainian diaspora showed up, very, very prominently in Ukraine to support and help develop the institutions, the government, the private sector, the commercial sector. This was largely fueled by the diaspora. And in that sense, it was like a political force for Ukraine in Ukraine. So I think where we need to take the next step is to do this for Ukraine in our own countries. Mm-hmm. So take that advocacy and agency proactively one step further. And there are institutions particularly in Canada and in the US that do, have a lobbying position and have, direct contact with politicians. That needs to be a global phenomenon, but we also, as I said, need people involved directly in politics who are of Ukrainian descent. More of them.
Maybe I want to add something. So if it comes to the beehive and it comes to Ukraine taking its own destiny, creating its own agency, I think my most impressive experience was Maidan, of course. This was like a beehive. If I may say so, I wouldn't come to that, but it was like an organization. It was a civil society organization. It became political, and so on. And that's for the model what I'm thinking of, because what Maidan actually did is that it connected people. And so not only from the inner bulb, so to say, where you belong to, but also outside of it. That's what made it so impressive and undefeatable, so to say. So shouldn't you think today about and I know it's not a small thing to think about, but to create a worldwide Maidan, in the sense where the Ukrainian diaspora could be the core of, but one of the basic things is what you then should do is not only build the coalition in your own national diaspora, but also the coalition with people like me. Well, I'm already there, but outside the diaspora. So let's say a very practical thing. I'm only watching this from the Netherlands, so I'm not very well known in the sense that what's happening in the United States or in Canada or in Italy, whatever. But what I see is, well, there's maybe what Christina's called soft power. There's a lot going on, and everybody is doing wonderful things. But what we didn't succeed in, and would be probably possible, to have 100,000 people in the peace palace in the Hague. But then we had to come out of the diaspora and come out to making coalitions with people who are not belonging to the diaspora, and that is how you use this social capital, as you so beautifully put it, Mychailo. So, and then you become this political power. So I'm just wondering how you see this.
I'm a little bit surprised that you're asking why don't we create a global Maidan. In my opinion, that is exactly what has happened in the last 3 to 4 months. Maidan, as a phenomenon of sort of grassroots mobilization, grassroots activism, has become a global phenomenon. At the same time, Maidan in Ukraine during the revolution, we have statistics today which show approximately 15 to 20% of the population was actively involved in one way or another, not necessarily protesting, but in fact supporting the Maidan, et cetera, et cetera. If we look at the mobilization that is happening at the moment, I think we have a very similar kind of proportion. Your question of why don't we have 100,000 people in The Hague protesting? Well, I think that we're working on it. Let's put it that way. But I think that the activists that are going to be required, the network that is required to organize 100,000 people is simply not there yet in the Netherlands. We've had over 100,000 people in various places in the United States and Canada. And because there's simply a network there that can organize it. And it's not simply Ukrainians. It's not people that are of ethnicity Ukrainian. I will return to my previous statement of I really think that today we're living in a world where, the stories that I'm seeing right now, obviously I'm in Ukraine, so I can't corroborate them, but everybody in the diaspora is telling me that, there's blue and yellow has become a very popular combination of colors in New York, in Toronto, in Sydney, in Amsterdam, and not just in Stockholm because it's their colors as well. The blue and yellow is becoming a phenomenon that is worldwide. So we come back to the statement: you are Ukrainian or you want to be Ukrainian. There are no other types of people in the world, and I think that that's really something that is the power of the diaspora, and also as a core to that. But we do, you're right, need to mobilize more of those people that want to be Ukrainian or want to at least associate themselves with the statement of, be brave like Ukraine. I think that that's one of the most powerful marketing messages that has come out in the last little while. Be brave like Ukraine, and reality is that it's really catching on worldwide.
I think if I can comment, because I know where it is coming from, we've had these discussions actually here in the Netherlands. So I understand also, because he's such a great friend and supporter of Ukraine. I understand the goal. I think the challenge is very big because, quite frankly, almost nobody who is alive right now in Europe experienced what happened after the Second World War or can remember it. So this whole this disaster, this human disaster, is catching us off guard. We're not prepared for it. And everybody, which is in some ways very heartening, the response has been amazing. As a Ukrainian, to see how non-Ukrainians have responded is amazing. It results in a big, huge lack of coordination, that's for sure. But you know what? There's so many needs. We have 60,000 displaced persons in the Netherlands. for a country of our size, it's much more than the diaspora can handle. The diaspora is doing a huge amount, but thank goodness that there's such a response from the Dutch government, from other ethnic groups, from the Dutch themselves. And you see this repeated all over Europe. In other countries, the diasporas are larger or more established, so maybe they can do more. But I have to say, relatively speaking, we've done a lot, and it's great that we're getting all this extra non-Ukrainian support, because I think Mychailo can corroborate, when we were growing up and fighting for dissidents, protesting to have dissidents freed, and protesting, against the Soviet Union, and protesting for Ukrainian independence, we were lone voices in the desert. And that's a big difference between now and then, is that, the world is on our side and supporting us. So, I think the kind of coordination that you seek, Ruth, it's a huge challenge under the current circumstances. I struggle with it myself. Maybe we'll get there, maybe we won't. It may be an imperfect thing, that we just have to coordinate where we can, and otherwise be grateful and receptive of the engagement and support that we get when we get it. And maybe when things are not quite as acute, we can think about how the diaspora can create more ties with these various organizations, and they're there. Believe me, they're there. It's just that I think we're all reacting right now.
Thank you. Also, I think it's very important what you say, that we have to appreciate what we are doing and what we are coming from, and in some sense also be a bit humble in what we ask from other people to do, and what we think that would be so important, because of the needs are so high, and so these are high stakes time, so to say. So just a last question, because we are already talking with us more than an hour. So how, in the near future, how you see the possibilities of developing the diaspora further as core of this political power, or what challenges do you see for us in that? Maybe Mychailo?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of words. I think that Christina probably remembers my father and his discussions way back in the late, I'm not sure, I think it was late 80s, early 90s. He wasn't particularly popular in this statement, but he said that, I think this was before Ukraine became independent and immediately after independence. He said, I think we in the diaspora need to realize that the diaspora is forever. This is not a temporary phenomenon. So we talked about the eternal Ukrainian diaspora. The diaspora needs to be strengthened periodically, and what we are seeing at the moment, unfortunately for Ukraine, is a strengthening of the Ukrainian diaspora in terms of people, and in terms of if it's also, I think, more importantly, that the centers of diaspora are no longer going to be limited to Canada and the US. I think that there are now going to be long-term Ukrainian communities in the European Union, like in the Netherlands. And that's going to create some challenges for Ukraine, because obviously there's going to be, that means brain drain, and it means fewer population in Ukraine. And already Ukraine was not exactly in the most wonderful demographic scenario prior to the war. It's going to get worse. This is reality. But if we now change that and realize that Ukrainians are a global force, and that the territory of Ukraine is home for everyone, no matter where they live on planet Earth, and that means an identity shift. It means a shift in the way of thinking. It means organizational shifts, perhaps, as well. But I think it, in the long term, could be something that is really a source of strength. I like to use our Jewish friends as examples in this case. Israel, as an independent country, has existed for over 70 years. That does not mean that all Jews throughout the world must return to Israel. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons that the Jewish community throughout the world is so strong is because of the fact that there is a connection to Israel, and at the same time, there is a diaspora. And it is an organized diaspora that maintains a separate identity that is integrated with the countries in which they live in. I think something very similar is probably going to happen in Ukraine, in Ukrainians, in the Ukrainian diaspora. It will require significant amounts of work on both sides, both from the Ukrainian state, from Ukrainians in Ukraine, and an understanding that this is a worthwhile thing to propagate and to promote in the various diaspora communities. Christina has been an absolutely fantastic person for organizing Ukrainians in the Netherlands, and I'm I want to use this opportunity to thank her for that, because it's been a tireless task. She's done a phenomenal amount of work. And
not on my own. I have there's a lot of people.
I know. There always is a lot of people. Christina, there's always a lot of people. We're a beehive. But of course, there's a lot of people. But credit where credit is due. And Ruth, thank you to you and for doing what you're doing, because at the end of the day, diaspora is about I think supporting values that are actually human values, and that means also bringing people into that values community like yourself, that have perhaps no ethnic background that is Ukrainian, but at the same time, I think identify yourself with something that we all identify ourselves with, and that is the values of freedom and just generally humanity. So thank you.
Thank you for that too. I think these are beautiful words to finish our conversation, don't you think? Yeah. So I want to thank you for being here in this 20th Don't Give Up Ukraine. I would have hoped that we would have already stopped with our live streams, because we said we will go on as long as the war takes it. And then last time I said, well, no, we will go on as long as Ukraine has won, so to say. So we will be there here sometime. But I think this is very important, what we are talking about. And I also keep thinking about, well, we have 42 million people in Ukraine, I think, so more or less. And now we have 20 million outside Ukraine. So 41? No, 42?
No. I was just going to ask if I could add.
You want to add something? So the diaspora, is that an immense social capital in the sense that you say to me right now? Okay, you want to add something?
No,
Christina?
I just want to add something that something that we also have ahead of us is the reconstruction of Ukraine. So not just the end of the war, but what happens beyond the end of the war.
Okay,
and
good.
This is going to also be a big challenge and a big role for the diaspora, and probably a point where there will be an opportunity for more political momentum as well.
Well, we are from the long term, the long breath, so to say. When I came first to Ukraine, we promised, we and my friends, it was 2007. So when you ask it in 10 years, we will still coming back to Ukraine, so to say. So, and we came back and we are still there. So we have some resilience and I think some patience, but also some, how do you say that? Some determination to do that, I would say. So thank you again for that. And we'll definitely see you again somewhere, someone, somewhen. Take care and be strong.